It appears to be live. I'm not going to stress too much about it, but we are recording it either way. So, welcome everybody. You have found yourself in an interactive panel discussion being put on by Blueprints of Disruption. We've called it Managing Narratives or Not, but believe me, it'll be more nuanced than that. And I will fully explain. Um, I'd like to. Okay, sorry. This happens to me every time I have to mute. Okay, so I'd like to start by acknowledging that all of the panelists here are coming to you today from a form of occupied territories. We can get into those details, but that's not what this is about. We also come from a country that we can see have also engaged in the genocide of indigenous peoples. It's not lost on us here at Blueprints that the genocide in Gaza and the preceding occupation absolutely mirror the colonization of the Americas in so many ways. Um, ways that ethnic cleansing, ways of ethnic cleansing that we settlers still benefit from and are witnessing again over in Palestine. Often it happens without much of a thought. So, in fact, much of our work here at Blueprints is, and I imagine yours, is obviously trying to get people to think about things, think about them differently. But quite often, our paths of discussion are dictated by our opponents, right? The talking points, manufactured crises, manufactured moral panic. There's lots of things that we can call it, but we're not often the drivers of these discussions. Even though we try to be, we seem to be on the defensive a lot. So that's why we're here tonight, and really that's why what we do at Blueprints. My name is Justin McLean. I don't like talking about myself so much, so I'll just leave it at that. But I'm here to facilitate the discussion tonight. You won't hear much from me, really. I don't have all the answers. This is why I called my comrades in, and I imagine I'll find it from the panelists and the participants. But like everything, no one person will have the answer. We're going to get where we need to go through a collective experience, and so that's why we create these kinds of spaces. And this panel here is larger, part of a much larger project that Santiago and he's a co-host here and one of the panelists, that we do at our Rabble Rousers cooperative. So right now we have two podcasts, but really, we do Rabble Rants. It's aimed at getting you enraged and informed, but then we provide blueprints of disruption, and we want that to be a toolkit for organizers to do what they do as meaningfully as possible, as effectively as possible. So that's just to give you an idea of what we do aside from, throwing events like this. So my call to action before I hand it over to the discussion and I'll have the guests introduce themselves is, if you don't already subscribe to our podcast, what? You can find it anywhere, like anywhere, whatever streaming service you use, it's on YouTube. So please subscribe. You can find us on socials, and we're still a very much growing podcast. So quite literally, any boost you give us, it is meaningful. And so we count on that word of mouth. So if you like what you see or hear, we'll also be dropping links to episodes that matter, or not matter, but that are relevant to the discussion or the guests. Some of we've had at our show before. So that's my pitch. Okay, so here's where the discussion goes, and where it comes from. Like, we've read so many stories in like legacy media, mainstream media. We're not here to shit on Dave, who will introduce himself in a second. There's particular culprits that issue for stories that have me just like scratching my head, and I want to laugh at them, but I can't, because they have fucking impact when they shouldn't. And my thoughts often go to like organizers like Anna and Fatima and other folks that are in the room now, when they've got all these things on their plate and a mission at hand that is undescribable and dealing with all of these stressors, and then bloop, someone will just drop this in the middle of their day, like claims that are so ridiculous, but they're forced to respond. They're forced to spend that precious energy defending something that they just couldn't have accounted for, something as innocuous as a weekly march, really, that they find ways to demonize. And I find these are often distractions we don't need, right? um but we can't just throw out the towel. Like, we can't just get frustrated and be like, okay, well, we just can't shape the narrative, so why bother? Just do what you're going to do, because it does matter. We know our opponents spend mad amount of money. They create think tanks, and when I say our opponents, I'm talking Zionists, yes, landlords, big oil and gas, capital, and they use a lot of that capital to shape public opinion, and there's no denying that has massive impact on what we're trying to do. But we obviously can't adopt their approach. We don't have that money, first of all, but also manufacturing consent really isn't a grassroots approach. It's not, we're not going to get where we need to go by kind of forcing an opinion on people. Um, anyway, that's a bit more complicated, and maybe we can kind of toss that out or hash that out as we go through. But either way, that's what we're going to do here. We're going to figure out how much energy we're spending. Where is it being effective? Are there better ways? And how are these harmful narratives like playing an impact on our decision making in whole? So with that in mind, let's get to like our first discussion question. So this one's going to go to Anna. um, and I really I wanted to get an idea, and other guests can chime in as well, especially if this was an experience for them. I'd like to get an idea from you on how much energy we're spending on fighting back against these narratives, like right now, uh, especially the more ridiculous ones being leveled at us. So I'm going to use the Mount Sinai incident, as I promised, as a case study. Uh, Feel free to add other ones of your own. Maybe there's more ridiculous ones we've not yet heard of. But sometimes that's the problem. Everyone heard about the Mount Sinai one, right? It started as a blip that we should have been able to just been like, that's so ridiculous. Um, but people just kept responding and responding, and it was almost like you were forced to respond. For folks who have no idea what I'm talking about, this was just like a march down the street, and someone managed to get a photo of someone in a Spider-Man costume on top of the Mount Sinai awning of an entrance, and it turned into a whole thing about Palestinian solidarity activists attacking a Jewish hospital, like Bonnie Crombie went off the wall, amongst other people. So it completely blew up over nothing. So I wish to be a fly on the wall of organizers in Toronto, especially, opening these stories and seeing one politician after the other commenting on this, gaining such traction, and then finally realizing you are, in fact, going to have to debunk some of this, respond in a way. What was that like?
Um, yeah, so I don't think I'll ever forget that because I was walking down the street with my friend at this protest and I like stopped and she was like, "Oh, you want to get a good pic?" And I was like, "Yeah, like look at this guy on the hospital. Like I gotta get a pic of that." And then like before I even got home, friends of Simon Wiesenthal shared it. All these other folks shared it. And it just like even it made Al Jazeera, like that's how far it went. And it's so ridiculous, right? Because I think like one of the key things about these stories is that they're meant to distract from what's going on, right? And but again, like when activists talk to mainstream media, like most of the time they're having us on to respond to these narratives, not really to like stand on our own, right? And so a big part of responding to these narratives is really what media wants to cover and really what gets interviews to sort of the left, right? And so often they have us on to counter these ideas of, Hamas at the beginning, anti-Semitism now. And I think it's really important that we push back the focus as we're on and having these conversations, right? And I think like the encampment is a really great sort of model of this, right? Because it's made so much news for its supposed anti-Semitism, the injunction, and every time you hear the students talk, they always say like we're here for Gaza, we're here for divestment. And it's really important, I think, to keep that main focus because things will always continue to come up, but use that platform to bring it back to the point, right? And so, during Mount Sinai, like one thing is that how noticeable is it that Canadian politicians actually have more outrage over Spider-Man on a hospital than the fact that there's no working hospitals in Gaza, right? And also shout out to Dave who not only wrote a great story on that incident, but was the only one to credit me with that photo.
It's also not so much about so yeah, you made that point where you have to respond and you are almost given a spotlight. So that's like the bonus of these ridiculous narratives sometimes, is that the media will then come to you and ask for comments. So you kind of can utilize that platform again. I'm worried about the efforts that are spent also debunking like each one of them. We all kind of heard the talking points go around where I said I wasn't going to get into them, but there was like a laundry list. So someone had to like do that research to know that, the door was closed, that the police were there. And that particular event was also attended by some notable people, or at least recognizable media outlets, right? Mainstream media outlets. And this was one of these examples that was like, no matter what you did, um, and no matter who was already covering it, you got the media there, and it was still like, what the heck happened? But yeah, using that platform. Dave, I wonder from a media perspective, you know what I realized? We forgot to introduce everybody. I told you I was out of practice. Um, Dave, I'm gonna go to you. When I go to you folks as panelists, can you just briefly introduce yourself so it's not super awkward and we can keep in the conversation? So my bad, everybody. I have notes for a reason. But yeah, Dave, like we talk to mainstream media, we don't get to decide what gets printed. And maybe with independent, you got to pare it down a little bit. But I'm wondering, the value of doing what Anna's saying by like responding, but trying to steer it back to Gaza, to Rafah, to the hospitals there. Like the mainstream media, do they then pick that messaging up or?
Yeah, so I'm Dave Gray Donald. I'm the publisher and editorial director at The Grind, which is about 2 years old. It's a print and online publication in Toronto. Thanks, Kim, for putting the info in the chat about it. Anyway, to the question, I I mean, I have I've done media training before, and the answer to that question is yeah, if you have the platform, you can just like, always bring it back to the talking points you have, which are, in this case, um, it was the beginning of the bombing of Rafah. That was what the march was for. It was like I can't remember the name. It was All Out for Rafah or something like that. And that like really didn't get into the mainstream coverage because at that point there were so many rallies happening that marches happening that the media, from what I've heard, there were sort of internal memos in the mainstream media of like, we're not covering these because they're happening so often and they're not stories anymore. They're nothing happens at them. So this one was an outlier because of the reaction to the Mount Sinai to Spider-Man. And so for me, I was just watching the next day and I was like, oh wow, like Doug Ford made a statement. This like doctor is on the news. Olivia Chow made a statement. Justin Trudeau made a statement. I wasn't even planning to cover that rally because I was there because these things sometimes happen. There's sometimes moments that get picked up on, and I was sort of looking for that, but I didn't think anything like that had happened until after the fact. But I remember I had a discussion with someone who reminded me that the rally was for Rafa. And so in doing an article on the rally, that was the first thing, you know, I wasn't going to responsibly do an article. It was just about this one person climbing on buildings. I was going to do an article that was about what the rally was for, what happened, then the reaction to it, and showing how the media narratives had spun out of control. And as you mentioned, Bonnie Crombie's statement was like that people had infiltrated the hospital and patient care was under attack, and no one had gone inside. So yeah, that's a little bit of what happened there. And just to also say that there's very little infrastructure that we have for doing this sort of text-based reporting. Like even mainstream media has limited ability to cover things like this. They do make choices not to cover things, but they also do have a lack of resources. The lack of resources is especially extreme in independent and left media. And so what happens then is that the mainstream media are just going to take whatever clips they get from people, whatever statements they get, and just say, this person said this. And that's sort of what the whole next day, no one did a fact check. Actually, Ben Cohen at the Star did a small story that wasn't really picked up on, but no one else did. Everyone just picked up on the statements, and that became fact. Just to wrap that come full circle, last week, Olivia Chow was on Ben Mulrooney's AM talk show on 640, AM 640. And she actually said, because Ben was pushing her on not showing up for the Jewish community, and in relation to something that happened around the March for Israel 2 weekends ago. And Olivia Chow said, I showed up for the Jewish community. I spoke out for the Jewish community when I made that statement about Mount Sinai. She is still saying that this was a real thing and that evidence of it is her statement. So just to say that some of these narratives get so cemented, she even admitted not long after the original fact that she didn't have all the facts and whatnot, but I think it's just a symptom. What I'm trying to say is it's a symptom of a lack of mainstream reporting capacity, what they want to look at, and also, article that I did for the Grind was one of our most popular. It's well read. It doesn't seem to have changed the mainstream narrative. I think that's to come back to your point.
That's got to be hard because that's, a lot of work goes in that. But I mean, it's not like Dave's job or the grind's job alone to get that done. And that was kind of one question I wanted to explore too. It's because a lot of my frustration and is that organizers kind of have better things to do, I feel like, than having to issue statements and um, field questions that were put on them by their opponents, like to waste their time. And one of the things, even the impetus of this conversation kind of had a strange um, source. I We did an episode with the Canadian Socialist Rifle Association. Hear me out. And their email tag for their spokesperson, and we called the episode this, is always shoot down range. And obviously, if we're talking about target practice, that has real kind of obvious meanings, but to them and to us, it has like a much broader meaning. How do we stay on target without being pulled to the sidelines, without being distracted? Um, and in this case, it's seemingly all the time, right? Because these are relentless. It just goes from one crazy narrative after the other that seems to be fully supported through the media and really opportunistic politicians. Um, and we have great independent media that covering this. The Grind is one of them. The Breach just did an excellent article about the criminalization of Palestinian solidarity activists, which is another narrative that's constantly being fought. You know, that everything that we do that's disruptive, even outside the Palestinian movement, is violent, is illegal, is not akin to proper democracy. So, um, my concern too is sometimes, and I'd like to find out from Anna and from folks. And if you, oh Santiago, I'm just seeing your message. Go ahead.
Sorry.
I'm trying to look at a lot of windows at once. I'm so sorry.
I had something I wanted to add to this too, because one thing that we talk a lot about when we're talking about the narrative, and I'll take a second to introduce myself. Hi, Santiago Hello Quintero, co-host of Blueprints of Disruption and freelance journalist. One thing we talk a lot about when we're talking about the narrative is the double standard, or the different standard that we're held to, um, on the left, or whatever you want to call it. Um, and that incident was one that brought up something for me, the Mount Sinai, because I tried to cover it as a student journalist. Um, I wasn't trying to cover the protest alone. I was trying to cover what was happening in Rafah, and I wanted then to talk about how it was not a target at Mount Sinai. And I had an article ready to go. I had interviews, I had everything. But my story got canned because I didn't have a Zionist perspective, which was apparently important to my props because I had to get both sides. But when you read all of the articles that came out of mainstream media, none of them had both sides. And it feels like that standard is always held, it's never held equally. They don't ever really look to balance out Zionist perspectives by talking to Palestinian organizers, at least not nearly as much as they should. And what ended up happening was, yeah, until Dave's article, there was nothing really fact checking it at all. And that really just brings up a problem with legacy mainstream media, right? Like this idea of objectivity, and that we're always going to be having to work harder to catch up to what's a given. Um, and I guess that just brings up a lot of questions of like, I know I see a lot of organizers when there's going to be an event happening, a protest happening, an occupy, whatever it may be, they're tagging all of the legacy medias. They're trying to get them to come out, and then they come out, and then they don't even talk to them, don't even include them in the articles, or don't even cover it at all. And so I guess I want to ask Dave, like, how much of an effort we should be making into including these legacy meet, like, should we be trying to talk? How much of an effort should we be making in trying to talk to legacy media? Is it worth the effort when so much of the time it creates more of a problem than we already had to begin with?
I will try to answer this question by talking about like campaigns and strategy in terms of what, I'm not a campaigner at the moment. I'm not doing that, but if you were doing a campaign, so I have experience in the environmental sector. So if your campaign is to try and change government policy, then the mainstream media narrative definitely matters. You have to, so you'll have to engage with it. So I think the short answer is yes, it's important. The longer answer is that we know, at least at this point, that the legacy media has certain biases, certain anti-Palestinian racism, um, various like the Zionist perspective is largely prioritized, and that's just the context you're dealing with. There's no like magic switch to turn it off. You have to deal with that. So when it comes to, for example, the Mount Sinai thing, I don't know how many people emailed editors, journalists, whatever at mainstream media and asked them to change their coverage. I didn't see any strategy around that. I didn't see anyone saying like here's like sign this letter or here's the template. Like honestreporting.ca, which is a pro-Israel media organization. They have a form. The Grind actually got targeted recently. We received like 300 emails over the course of a day or two. But I don't know if anyone did that with like CBC, CP24, City News, asking them to correct their coverage. There's a lot of coverage that we see that there are factual inaccuracies that just never get corrected. And it's partially that Canada no longer has a media criticism news outlet, not a credible one anyway. And so I don't know if people are doing that work. There's a difference between trying to engage deeply with mainstream media and posting on social media. Most journalists care about Twitter. They don't really care about Instagram. If you're working at or something, whereas a lot of our organizing or a lot of movement organizing happens on Instagram, to some degree Twitter, or more like not organizing but messaging. So I'll leave it there for now.
I wonder when we're brainstorming as organizers, and this will be to Anna, but yeah, a few of our panelists couldn't make it. So, and I know we're a room full of organizers for the most part. So if you feel like you've got something to add to the discussion, please raise your hand, or you can use the comments if you don't want to be on camera and you don't want the spotlight on you there. But I'd absolutely love to hear from folks too on how we decide as organizations on whether we even respond. And let me just, again, it's not so black and white here. I have like a theory of sorts that there's like three basic ways. Like this is still without nuance, I suppose. Like not respond at all, pretend it didn't happen. There was no Spider-Man. I don't care about him, like, or respond and debunk, spend time explaining why it's not a problem, why this and that isn't anti-Semitic, why tenants have the right to strike, and all of these other narratives. And then there's the third way, which would be to, almost akin to what Anna said at the beginning, your own message. Just plow ahead still, stay on target, just use those opportunities to reiterate your core messages that you've always wanted to get out. Like try to be as opportunistic as possible when these kind of moments arise where the spotlight is on not where you want it. And there's obviously like even nuance there between, a variation of sorts where you do kind of debunk, but then try to refocus, without compromise. So, and I do find that as we go along and this continues, it's just one after the other, are you more or less inclined to kind of just ignore some of the more ridiculous claims and accusations? Or is there still, like, because they gain so much traction, is there still this pull to actually respond to them in any way? And, how much energy is being spent on doing that kind of management?
Yeah. I think that it's there's no like hard and fast formula to it, right? And sometimes, what the folks who, organized the action that became suddenly like very, intense don't want to, address it, but maybe other community groups end up doing that too, right? And so I think there's a lot of ways, take Mount Sinai, for example. I think there were a lot of just regular everyday people who were like looking up the hours of the doors and stuff like that, right? Another thing to it is like it's important to remember like the kind of humans behind this, right? And so like for Spider-Man, like Spider-Man wanted to put out a statement. Spider-Man did not like being called anti-Semitic by the prime minister, right? So and I think same with like a lot of the hate crime charges that have been coming out. Like it feels terrible when you're accused of a hate crime, and it can feel really good to speak out and say, I don't hate anyone. I just don't want to see Palestinians murdered, and so I think there's a lot of kind of like those considerations within it. But I think what's really great about the mass movement that's happening right now is that, there's a lot of space for people to continue doing the hard work of like pushing the narrative forward while other people kind of, do that sort of not backtracking, but like, context building, I guess. And um so I think there's no like magic formula, but there's definitely like lots of things to sort of consider when big things happen, right? And then of course, like if mainstream media is contacting you, like those are perhaps the opportunities to really like get in front of it and say like, I don't care what you're here to talk about, 15,000 dead children,
Yeah, it's so hard to get pulled into these side discussions. Some of the comments in the chat there, remind us of the importance to be amplifying your own narrative. And Tim Ellis makes the extra point there of like knowing algorithms, which maybe a lot of us don't understand at all, but he's explaining that, when you are directly responding, you're actually boosting that original video. So finding your own way to create content to set your narrative and uh, is a much more effective social media approach in terms like a technical perspective there. And I know Tim does a lot of work with Canada Truth, which, its purpose is to directly kind of set the narrative. And I imagine do some debunking. It's just one of the concerns that I have when we try to explain away, deny, or debunk some of the claims. And here I'll offer another case study that in the student encampments, a lot of the claims facing the students to delegitimize, and that's what all these are, right? Is to meant to delegitimize our work. But one that they use is that they're not all students, or they're not all U of T students. Even York University used that language in their release. Like, these are intruders that have come onto campus. And, so you see students demonstrating, here's a major, here's a student, here's their major, here's their story. They're emphasizing that faculty are also there and providing proof of such. And that seems really straightforward, right? It's they are mostly students, but the reality is there are allies there too. There are people that aren't students, that aren't faculty, and that's okay. And so, and this is just one example of where sometimes we very innocuously respond to these narratives that in ways that can either paint us into a corner or at the very least place these artificial limitations on us. Let me explain. So the student encampments are in fact actually liberated zones, part of the community, as students are part of their community, as the public institution of the university is part of the community. So it would be completely valid for other community members to partake in this encampment, but they are being forced to legitimize themselves based on the rules of this institution and not of the world we're trying to build. This is making sense. So, and this has impact, not just because, okay, like we tell the media, we prove the media that we are students, that we're allowed to be here. Most of us are students, like they'll concede that. And this is no fault to them at all. But what it does is it erases some of the community work that's done, the fact that other university campuses have put resources into strengthening this encampment. And this isn't like, oh, you didn't give them credit. They understand the plan, but it doesn't open up either that possibility that these are legitimate zones to be occupied by people that don't have to necessarily be students. Their demands don't necessarily have to be aimed solely at the institutions, right? Just because you say we can only ask the university because they're the only people that can kick us off campus, right? That's not necessarily true, but we've been forced into kind of fitting these molds because of the narratives being thrown at us. So, Anna, if you feel like you can comment like on that or other ways in which we've kind of been forced to respond, and it can be even like logistically alter march routes, so we're not going by Mount Sinai anymore, or the Thornhill Synagogue is another example where it was like, okay, they will be able to set a very certain narrative, but we have a mission at hand. Will we be distracted by this artificial kind of uh narrative? So
Yes. Also say Fatima just joined. Hello. Um and so I think this is like I think for my organizing, especially being Jewish, like this is a big kind of point that we argue over a lot, right? And I think there's no right answer. We're not leaving here with answers, right? But one thing that I always say is like if we, change our route so that it doesn't go next to Mount Sinai, like they're gonna find something else, right? We will have gone by some Jewish star sticker, or something like that, right? So, you know, there comes a certain point where like, like my MP, Christia Freeland, her office is across from the JCC. So suddenly protesting at my MP's office is racist, like, or it's anti-Semitic, right? Like there's just, it's like if you give a mouse a cookie, sometimes I think you gotta like hold a hard line just because there's never gonna be something that's not okay, right? Like, they say no, like physical resistance, BDS, still not okay, right? So like all these things, nothing will ever be like acceptable. So I think to a certain extent, like, be mindful, but don't like bend.
absolutely. I wonder, Fatima, if you've had a chance to orient yourself here. That question was actually supposed to be for you, so I definitely would love to have your impact input on it, and I'm wondering if you heard it.
First of all, I'm so sorry. For some reason, I thought you guys meant 6 o'clock Mountain Time. So I'm sitting here like just doing my thing, trying to kill time for an hour. And sorry about that. We're gonna call it Arab Standard Time. Sorry about that. So I'm just gonna take a minute to honor and acknowledge that I am on Treaty 6 lands, traditional homelands of Nehewak, Dene Nakota, Soto, and Métis, Amiskwachi, Waskahigan. And yes, I do have the notes you sent me, so I appreciate that, Jessa. And I think I know what question you were asking. I'm not sure if you want me to do an intro of myself first.
Yeah, well, see, we're all having a day because I forgot to let anybody do intro. So we're doing it as you've answered the question.
Okay.
Anna never got to it. I mean, we've done 3 episodes with Anna. I figure if you're here, you know who she is. But and the next time you speak, maybe you can tell people who
Listen, you just made me feel
are.
so much better about this little hiccup. So that's great. If everybody's having a day, then that's good. So I'm a mother of 4 here in Edmonton, so-called Edmonton. I'm a daughter and granddaughter of Palestinian refugees. Both sets of my grandparents were forcibly and violently displaced from their homes in a tiny farming village called Imghar al-Khait, which is a suburb of Safad in the northern part of, it's the northernmost part of Palestine. My paternal grandmother was 5 months pregnant with my father when she was shot in the back and forced to walk, as were about the other 500 people from our village. They were forced to walk to Lebanon to safety. She was okay. She had the baby, my father, and he was born in October of 1948 to extreme poverty. So recently, the images of the most recent escalation of this genocide were particularly triggering for our family, as I'm sure they were for many Palestinian families, as we were all collectively raised on this story of trauma and Nakba survival. That story of trauma and Nakba survival truly lives within the collective Palestinian memory, and it lives within our blood and runs through our veins. Currently, I'm one of the organizers within the Palestinian Solidarity Movement here in Edmonton. We organize the weekly rallies. My main concern right now is the genocide. I am unapologetic about how I am viewed as I try to best advocate for an end to the onslaught of the Israeli aggression and the Canadian complicity within that genocide. I often say that I have been told to go back to where I came from since I was 6, and I have been called terrorist since I was 16. So I am unfazed by the quote unquote narrative, because the narrative has never seen me as anything other than other. The narrative has always been weaved and presented to the masses to dehumanize people who look like me, to manufacture the consent to commit the atrocities that are committed against Indigenous, Black, and racialized populations, and to dispossess and annex resources and lands of those peoples. I am humbled to be with all of you here today, and I thank you guys all for having me. The question about direct action and language and movements being framed as inherently violent or criminal, I think I can speak for most Palestinians when I say that we are so far beyond the point of where we fear being labeled as anything. The most important thing that we are drawing and redrawing attention to Palestinians undergoing a genocide in this current moment, and the Canadian connection to that genocide. Not enough people on these stolen lands are aware of just how much so-called Canada is complicit within this current genocide and the current portion of this genocide, because it is not new. And that is being enacted on the Palestinian people in Gaza. We assert the right to disrupt the normalization of day-to-day life as these 2,000-pound bombs are being dropped. And I sometimes think of that number and how large these bombs are, and the fact that this is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. And then you hear people say things like, well, you guys are being too loud and it's every week and it's too much. Like, do you realize what you're saying? It's absolutely mind-boggling to me that you can complain about weekly rallies when, the numbers say 40,000 dead, but we know in reality, it's quite literally 4 times that amount, maybe, and most likely 8 times that amount. And that terrifies me. So it's not normal. It's not normal to have to watch a genocide of your people being live streamed. And it's not normal just because it's my people, because it's not normal for any people to be genocide and to be live streamed. You're watching it in real time. It's unfiltered, it's unedited, and it's terrifying. Every day I say I've seen the worst thing I've ever seen. And the next day I'm proven a complete liar because something even more horrific pops up on my screen. And again, we're unapologetic about the fact that, we're being disrupted. And people are saying things like, oh, this is too much. Do you see what's on your phone? Have you even opened up any type of app or any type of to see what's going on, and you're complaining? But you know what? We're in Edmonton and the Oilers are playing tonight. And downtown is chock full of people, but none of that is disruptive. People are out there being completely belligerent, but none of that is considered violent. They completely swept houseless communities out of specific areas of our downtown core to make space for this, for a hockey tournament. And that is not violence. The language, it's not normal. So our movement is one centered firmly in principles of liberation and decolonization. And the language around that and how that makes others feel, to me, is irrelevant, period. Here in Edmonton specifically, we've had Zionists portray our weekly rallies as hateful and as terrorist rallies. And this is people like sitting MPs like Michael Cooper and other organizations like JFED, Jewish Federation of Edmonton, as well as podcast hosts. They came for our chants and our signs, and they said things like, you can't say things like from the river to the sea, which this was across Canada. But here more specifically, we had chants like, say it loud, say it clear, we don't want no Zionists here. People didn't like that. This is not new to us as Palestinians. So we outright refute these narratives projected onto us that ultimately serve to draw on racist tropes like we are savage or we are uncivilized and dangerous and anti-Semitic. None of that is new. It's just another way to manufacture consent for law enforcement to brutalize our bodies when we become too disruptive. Recent examples of this include the encampment sweeps at the universities in Alberta, spaces that were truly a beautiful example of what society could look like. Free and uninhibited learning, shared culture, and Shabbat dinners and Islamic prayers in congregation, teach-ins, food being dropped off and shared and consumed together. And in challenging this institutional status quo and demanding the disclosing of investment in the genocide, the students were met with force and brutalization. And I see that one of the faculty members is on this call, and you might have seen it online, where he was just screaming like, these are my students, leave my students alone. And it was gut-wrenching to watch. So they're trying to paint us and these kids, really kids, as violent. And you watch faculty members putting their bodies on the line, saying, leave our students alone. Who's violent? Is it because you're wearing a uniform? And where have we seen this before? Quite literally, where have we seen it before? Where just because one side is wearing a uniform that you deem to be the okay and correct uniform, you're projecting these narratives, but we reject it. And it reminds me specifically about how they can frame these protests, whether it's out in the streets marching, being loud, disrupting the flow of traffic, and draining police resources, which is always great, by the way, or occupying a space on a campus, quite literally being in community and taking good care of each other. They can try to frame these things as violent, as a means to an end. And at the end of the day, all they're doing is trying to sell the public a narrative in advance that they are justified in their brutality because they're inevitably going to shut it down in an effort to control. Frantz Fanon said, and I'm paraphrasing here, you can't divorce violence from those who are oppressed while ignoring the structural and material violence that is imposed on these people every single day. So as I said earlier, it's not new. They want to paint us as violent and disruptive and savage because they continue to do those same things because it's worked in the past. So now we have to challenge that. It's recycled. They've recycled these narratives because they've worked historically.
Thank you, Fatima. And you bring up a point that I actually want to digest and as a group. But I'll go back to you first because you brought it up. And it has to do with, again, like the student occupations or encampments. But what they are occupations of sorts. I know we don't like that word. Liberation zones much better describes them. But there are times where we're taking buildings, or there are people taking buildings, administrative buildings, and they're not building zones, they're upping the ante, right? They are escalating the resistance to a degree. And I wonder if no matter what we do, it's painted as violent. And this isn't limited to the Palestinian solidarity movement either, right? It's all modes of resistance are always painted as violent or harmful to society in whatever ways that they like to do. So I'm wondering, when we frame it as peaceful, is that the same as asserting our right to resist? Because I would like to maybe open up the idea that some of the things that we do or will do aren't peaceful. I mean, poverty is violence, right? So like they're unfairly painting us as violent when we're sitting in an administrative building, legs crossed, singing songs. But also when we are picking up barricades and facing off against police in riot gear or throwing projectiles. No judgment, okay? Bonk bonk. Like, that's not what I'm not here to judge people's actions, but I think we can concede that some of the things that we do aren't actually peaceful. They're not meant to be peaceful, and they don't have to be peaceful, right? I acknowledge we're in a class war. People are fighting a genocide. Palestinians have the right to armed resistance. So it feeds into all of that forcing us to frame ourselves as peaceful so that we won't be booted out of spaces, so we won't be charged, so we won't be demonized in the media. And, Fatima just gave us great examples where that's happening anyway. So perhaps, is there value in moving away from that peaceful assertion towards that right to resist? Unapologetically. It's dangerous though, right? Because you even mentioned it opens us up to attacks and actual police action, but we're kind of open to those attacks anyway. So let's just kind of talk about that, because we do often use that language, right? It was a peaceful sit-in. We call them peace activists. And that's not always completely accurate.
Honestly, I think there's a problem with the framing. I think the minute you say peaceful protests, we chant it all the time, no justice, no peace, right? So a protest in itself is not peaceful. You are disrupting the peace by definition. I think my question would be, what is your goal with a protest? You are disrupting the peace just by marching. You are disrupting the peace just by being anywhere and doing a sitting. You are already disrupting the peace. So it's antithetical to say peaceful protest in my mind. That's how I feel about that. So when I don't frame protests as peaceful protests, a protest in itself is not peaceful. The whole point of it is to disrupt the peace because you're trying to get something done. So do I think that we need to reframe that? Yes, I think that we need to reframe that. The whole point of a protest is to disrupt the people around you so that they pay attention to something. Do I think it needs to go to a point where we're, like you said, projectiles and becoming, doing things that might get you arrested? I think every single person has their own limits and levels of what they want to do. And there are a lot of people that want to take it to that level. And I think that's an individual thing, really. So there are a lot of people that will, and, keep in mind that this is, there's a lot of people that will want to do that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So I'm not sure what you're asking. If you're asking in the context of so-called Canada, or if you're asking me the do you condemn Hamas question. Which I'm completely
Believe
like, we chant it all the time in our protests. When people are occupied, resistance is justified.
Yeah, I would never ask you
Yeah,
if you condemn Hamas, but it is that kind of forced pigeonhole that some fall into easier than others. Politicians will be at a certain level of being able to answer on the Palestinian resistance, and that's pathetic, but it's just what happens. But I am kind of all of what I talk about, kind of we can apply to all of the movements. But I
yeah.
think the examples that we're going through here are very specific to the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, which has its own set of obstacles and barriers that have to keep in mind, and urgency also, right? Like, do we have time to bring everybody along and convince them what we're doing is okay? Or it's like, we don't have time for you. I'm going to do this
Yeah. The issues
anyway.
with Palestinian solidarity movements, and I'll say, first of all, I don't think anybody in the Palestinian solidarity movement in the past eight and a bit months has thought that this was going to go on as long as it did. So a lot of us are trying to figure it out as we go. One. Two, I think that there's an issue with having religious groups, cultural groups, and grassroots organizers trying to figure it out, especially in the smaller cities. So I think in Toronto, they've got it a little bit more figured out. I think in the smaller cities, they're trying to figure it out as to who's doing what. I think that grassroots organizers, like you said, they're trying to figure out who is more willing to take on more direct action, more disruptive action. And that being said, what does disruptive action mean? There's a lot of people that will throw out the word disruption, but I have yet to hear, what do you mean by disruption? Like, even within the context of this call, what do you mean specifically by disruption? Does that mean blocking roadways because there's arms manufacturer? Because I would be all about that. But I think it would be specific to different actions. You know what I mean? Like, are we talking burn it all down? Or are we talking, let's make sure that people really see us and really pay attention to what we're trying to get done here?
I'm kind of in the burn it all down crew, but I want to hear from Santiago. You've been eerily quiet. Anna, I saw you were chewing on something, so I'm going to go to you next. But like, I want to hear about from you on both of that framing that we seem to be stuck in, and peaceful, and perhaps we can comment on Aaliyah's comment in the chat there, where I said we almost feel forced to call them anti-war protesters or peaceful protesters, and they suggested reframing it anti-genocide, anti-apartheid. Or, there's ways to label things without playing into the both sides narrative that we feel obligated to sometimes, I suppose. But to the other panelists there, did you want to chime in on that? Anna, so when you are planning it, yeah, that's right. When you're planning actions now and like knowing this exists, does it play into your mind that possibility of being labeled as X, Y, or Z? And are or to remain peaceful, especially when you are representing some of the bigger organizations, right? So like, we can have autonomous groups take action and kind of worry about their PR and distance themselves kind of strategically. But sometimes you're out there representing organizations that do have to worry about public perception to a degree. And so is that playing into, where you're willing to go, or how disruptive you're willing to be under a certain banner? Or have people kind of let go of that?
Can I add something to the
Oh,
question?
now, yes, I would like you to.
Because I want to bring up a specific example to make it more difficult too, which is the example of Palestinian land being sold at Jewish synagogues, and the protest there, right? Because everybody knew when that was happening, if there was protest there, what the narrative would be, right? It was very clear, and that created a certain like hesitancy, like of whether or not like do you let it go? Or do you go in and protest anyways, knowing that you're going to be framed as anti-Semitic, knowing that it's going to be more difficult to defend it in this specific circumstance, and that's kind of the point of it, right? It's in a way, it's bait, right? It's made to be more difficult to defend. And I guess what the approach would be with in those circumstances too. I'll throw it to Anna.
Yeah, I think things have changed a lot in the last 9 months, things IJV might not have, signed on to in October, we're signing on to now, right? And I think like the more and more that we see this happen, the less and less we care that, this narrative that has never gone in our favor is going to continue to not go in our favor, right? And I think like, you know, again, like 9 months in, what I have been seeing in the world is vastly different than 2014, than 2021. And I think people are waking up, people are realizing what's happening, and there's not so much you can't go back from this, right? And so, I think that at this point, like if you're not supporting Palestine because someone blocked your car for 45 minutes on your route home, it's not about Palestine, it's about white supremacy, right? And so, um, like when that real estate thing happened, we were very hesitant as the Jewish group that probably should have been the first ones there to be there, right? But when it went down, we were there, right? Because at the end of the day, like, fuck the narrative because like lives are at stake, right? And I think as this continues on and as we feel it, and I love this idea of like, disturbing the peace because like, man, who in this Zoom room has had any peace since October, Like, so like I think it's at a point now where it's like people are really putting the issue first because it needs to go first, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Did anybody else want to chime in on that before I kind of steer us to a different now?
Sure. I'll just say I think there's been a change in people and sort of like who were not very aware of what was going on in Palestine, Israel in the last while. And there's, for since 1948, there's been this narrative of Palestinians as like inherently violent. And I think there's been a shift now to seeing like the sort of like some lie behind that, or like the lie behind that, and also seeing the violence that Israel requires. And but I think in terms of like the synagogue in Vaughan, Thornhill in Ontario, and the that real estate sale of like West Bank land, and illegal like West Bank land, was that I think we should distinguish between like violence and like not peaceful or something. So like there was actual violence there where like um this I think a former IDF soldier like kicked a young woman in the stomach. There was another guy who was like planning to attack someone with a knife, and is a pro-Israel guy was trying to attack someone with a knife. There was someone who pepper sprayed people. It was pro-Israel. That's like actual violence. Um, and so the other side was not like violent, but it was like, is being in a road not peaceful? I just think when we talk about like whether things are peaceful or not, it's like, are you talking about property damage or like blocking something or like actually hitting people, beating people? Like, so it has to be very precise with language here because the way that like the Toronto Sun or the National Post or something, they're always saying like the Palestinians are violent. Their rallies are saying that they're gonna like, there's this imminent threat all the time of like the violence is imminent. Um, and so being really specific about what has been happening, I think is a necessary sort of step. And because a lot of people are seeing like, oh, they're doing these rallies in Toronto, for example, rallies every weekend, and no one was getting hurt. And then it started escalating a bit, and then Land Day, they beat the shit out of people, the Toronto police. That's physical violence on people. So I think a lot of people are having this aha moment. They're like, oh, it's not the Palestinian protesters and like the solidarity movement who are beating people up. It's like the cops. It's these people in the rally at Thornhill, like the guy with the nail gun. So yeah, I think that's an important distinction to make.
Yeah, absolutely. And the contradictions there are just so obvious. Sometimes there's nothing else you have to say. And that kind of brings me to the next question really is, and it's important to make the distinction between when we talk about managing the narrative of doing educational work. Different movements are in different spots, they have different goals. And, like, so NECBA education is absolutely necessary because a lot of people don't know what that is or what its relevance is to today. So, whereas, the climate change, climate justice, I think they've done the education and now it's just, how much energy is spent trying to convince people the planet's on fire. But and this will vary from movement to movement. It'd be hard to answer that, but I'm wondering, when we talk about the narrative being important, we can see by polls that more and more Canadians are looking at Israel in a bad light, whether it's the legitimacy of the occupation or the level of force that they've used. And I wonder how much of that is from the endless efforts of activists to work on the narrative and to issue media releases and all of the stuff that goes into kind of countering that right to defend itself, versus people just genuinely being able to access this, obviously through boosts, and we do it again too, but the images that come across and the evidence that's just out there for the world to see. There's other cases where this is obvious, where it's just so obvious to people what is happening. How much work do we have to go into pointing that out or regurgitating it or amplifying it? Like, is that enough? Is exposing the truth enough? Or does there need to be like more finesse put into it? Yeah, there are no appropriate emoticons to reply to the comments that we're seeing here. I apologize that for the Zoom room. There's no angry face, and no one wants to clap for what we're saying here. Aaliyah, I see you. But so if folks want to, maybe Santiago, you can help kind of talk to that and maybe your opinion on what's been most effective, just laying the bare truth or having to kind of construct narratives around them.
Yeah, I think the truth is often not enough. This is an issue when tackling propaganda a lot of the time, because I mean, it really depends in the moment and what your target audience, who you're trying to reach in a particular moment is. If you're trying to speak to as many people as possible, people who might not agree with you, the truth is often not enough because if they've already have an idea in their head, they've already have a side that they're leaning towards, the propaganda is quite effective because they want to believe it, right? That's the cognitive dissonance, which is like that anxiety that people feel when they're forced to consider two contradictory things, something that might go against an inherent belief that they have. Everyone wants to believe that they're good. And if you give them an easy way to not have to change what they believe and still believe that they're right and that they're good, they're going to jump on that. which is why so often, like, Israeli propaganda is quite lazy. It's not changed a lot. It's predictable. It's laughably predictable, but it's effective because of that. And so, like, in my opinion, often what's most effective is just a complete redirect, like not letting them drag you into talking about what they want to talk about, right? And just talking about something completely different. I think a good example of this was when Bassem Youssef went on the Piers Morgan show, and he had him completely baffled because he just did not respond the way that he was expected to respond to. And that reached a lot of people. And I think that that's sometimes a problem when we're trying to talk, whether in the media or wherever there is a platform, when we allow ourselves to be dragged into responding things. They know how to keep you there. They know how to prevent you from speaking the points that you want to speak. And so it's important, like I was saying, to just not play into the game and completely redirect it back to the issues, as Anna was saying earlier on. Yeah.
David, did you have something to chime into that? Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you can all hear me. I'm joining a little bit late here, kind of on the fly. Just a few little comments, and I may have missed some of it. So if I have, please excuse me if I'm repeating anything here, a little off topic. But the mainstream media isn't going to, no matter what we do, they don't like us and they're going to misrepresent us, I think, pretty much. And they're out of line with public opinion, as we've seen in recent pollings. And I think there's a very interesting article just within the last day or two, it's been making rounds on the net, that there's a whole generation nowadays, especially the younger people, who are getting all their news from TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, whatever. They're not even listening. I mean, how many people read a newspaper or watch TV news anymore? And when they do, they're noticing this huge gap between, what we hear on the internet from all sorts of other sources and what's being presented to us, through the MSN. So I think my own point here is that we really have to develop our own narrative. And I think be developing it and pursuing it more so through these other, through the social media and the other type of apps that are available. And we have to kind of take hold of that ourselves and focus on that. Not that you can ignore the other ones, but I think, a lot more has to be done on, reaching out to all these other groups that use that media besides, just ourselves or people who are already hip to what's going on. And I think the other point I'd like to make is when we see the reporters and things at these different events, a lot of them are hostile. They're ambushing people. They're getting Joe Blow. Well, what do you think? And he may be well-intentioned, but he doesn't really know what's happening or kind of understand a lot of the undercurrents. So I noticed that when I was at one of the UT events not too long ago, they were telling the crowd, like, don't talk to the reporters. And they were walking around on the edge trying to get people to say things. And, God knows how they'll use it, right? We really have to kind of encourage that, I think, amongst a lot of the people that are there. They have to have spokespeople ready who can talk to them if they're willing. And I think also to kind of narrow it down, like, there are a few that are receptive. Maybe we got to start, just focusing on them and block the others out. And if you look at it, a lot of the other, like the political stage now, I hate to mention the federal conservatives, but their news is all online and between themselves. They really, they do project outwards, but they have their own little thing happening. And I think that's what we got to focus on, looking at getting reporters and people who we know are on side and just focusing on them, encouraging, our members or people at the rallies, not to just speak freely with all of these reporters that are out there. And I think it's starting to happen. I'm not able to get a lot of people going to talk to anymore. And thirdly, to be focusing on developing our own narrative through the social media and with a little less concern about what's happening in the wider one, because no matter what you do, they're not going to accept us, or if they think, well, we're peaceful or not peaceful. It doesn't matter. They're just going to make up lies and spread that ways. So just my little 2 bits there to add to the conversation.
Thank you, David. You actually brought up a point there that maybe we can go to Dave for, and Santiago hinted at it earlier, and we've talked about it before, so I know it's a bone he wants to pick in talking to mainstream media. And I'm not gonna name the event, but I was at an event where there was a set time to start and a rally, lots of people. And it didn't start on time. It started 40 minutes late because the organizer was giving interviews to Global and CBC and some of the other larger outlets that were there. Um, and the sound bites and quotes that were used were not helpful, not really. But they had prioritized that interaction and were very excited about it, came back and said Global spoke to me, and like we're really encouraged that the message was going to go out there. And I felt kind of bad I didn't interject, but I'm wondering, Dave, if there are more effective ways to engage with media, or like Santiago suggested, not just have a media spokesperson, but be very picky about who we actually even give our time to. Because it's not just that they manipulate what we're having to say. It's like that you spend time, resources, maybe draw up notes to do these interviews. And we've seen from a lot of Palestinian activists directly that they've put so much emotional energy into some of these interviews that have been misrepresented. And it ends up all that energy actually working against you. So are there any kind of media strategy suggestions there? Because right now we feel like instead of like don't talk to cops, it's like don't anybody talk to the press. But that wouldn't help you very much. So let's be a little more nuanced about it.
I don't have a whole lot to add, just to say, I think there were a lot of people who got involved in this who have like not as much experience with media, haven't been like spokesperson trainings. And just like one very quick thing is like a media interview is not a conversation. It's like you're trying to get your points across. It's not, you just like stick to the point, and because they're going to use any little side thing um, and can spin it any which way. But I'm actually more interested in what Fatima has to say about media. I know there have been a lot of people who've just like you're saying, not engaged with media at all, or had different groups engage with media, different people be the spokesperson. Because I think Palestinians are just so used to being vilified in the media for like generations. So I know it's been a very, very tough challenge.
Yeah, thanks for that. I often say that Palestinians have been trained since we were young on how to speak on the Palestine question, just like Black kids have been trained since they were young on how to deal with cops. This is something that we are raised on. When somebody talks to you about Palestine, this is how you respond. This is how you speak on it, because it can be quite a bit of backlash if you speak on it in the wrong way. In the past 8 months, I feel like a lot of us have, like I said at the beginning, started to care a lot less about how we're framed, especially living in the West and post 9/11 and a lot of the experiences that we've been through. But speaking to media here, and I've done a lot of media in Edmonton, you learn to make sure that there's somebody watching, somebody videotaping on the side, so that your words are not misrepresented. But I think it's really important to go backwards and rewind a bit and talk about something that David brought up earlier, and to really pay attention to what's happened in the past 8-9 months and how the narrative has shifted. So I'm 40. In my lifetime and in my father's lifetime, he's 75. This is the first time in this extension of the genocide that the narrative has truly shifted, and people who had never heard Palestine before, who had never understood what this was all about before, have really now taken a look at it and understood what it is. And that's all of because of journalists on the ground and because of the phenomenon of social media. You started to see it a little bit in 2021 and what happened in that part of the what they call mowing the lawn. Israelis call mowing the lawn, and that lasted a much shorter time than this iteration of it. And so the journalists on the ground are doing the bulk of the work. And this is specifically why the Israeli lie cannot continue, because Palestinian journalists are showing you the real story, and what we've seen, you can't unsee anymore. So mainstream media in Canada, in the US, and UK, in the global north, they all use the same sources and they recycle this content, and it becomes sort of this self-fulfilling self-fulfilling thing that they put out these stories and then they consume the same content from their own sources. So CBC puts something out and then CTV puts something out, and they kind of just reaffirm each other. But you're getting now this content from Palestinian journalists on the ground, and people are consuming it through social media, and now they're asking questions. So when we're answering questions to these biased media sources here in Canada, we can draw on these other resources and say, did you see the images that came out of Rafah today? Did you see that image that, of course, was unedited? It was raw footage. You know, there's AI checkers now. It's not like anybody can say this was faked. You can't say it was propaganda. You can't, this was live streamed. So now there's this way to refute all of these Israeli lies. And Palestinians finally have a way, and it's incredibly heartbreaking that Palestinians have to showcase their suffering and had to continue to showcase it for 8-9 months in such graphic ways, and still are told, you know, Canada stands with Israel, and have this 50,000 people walk with Israel right after everything that happened with Rafah, and this image that came out of this actual beheaded baby, when this entire genocide was manufactured, the consent for it was manufactured on a lie of 40 beheaded babies. So I think that a lot of Palestinians don't need media training, but I do think allies could learn a lot from journalists on the ground. And I think a lot about Mohammed al-Kurd and his viral video clip of when he was asked, you know, do you condemn all of the violence that has come from when they tried to steal, you know, when they were stealing your home, and the resistance of that? And he said, well, do you condemn the fact that they're stealing my home? So I think just the reframing of that and showing you can't condemn people who are just resisting their occupiers.
Thank you, Fatima. Definitely, yeah, a unique perspective coming from a Palestinian having to live and breathe this, not just since October. We're kind of getting near the end of the event. We're gonna end at 8 o'clock. I like to keep on time as best as possible, but we've had a lot of great input from the audience, so be sure to kind of keep your eye on the chat there. Tim even gave a bit of advice in terms of media strategy savvy. It's just repeating your points, right? Not to get drawn into the question exactly. And although it might sound like a politician where you're not answering the question, that's fine. They're just using the sound bites. The question isn't even often in the broadcast. It's just your answer anyway. So it's okay to sound like politicians once in a while, I suppose. We'll give you a pass then. Otherwise, politicians also, though, have that added annoyance of always watering down and having to kind of placate to centrists, whereas activists and organizers are a little bit freer to be unapologetic in the points that they're defending, and that right to resist. So I'm gonna open the floor to questions to our panelists. So like that's Fatima, Anna, Dave, and Santiago, and just try to keep your question as brief as possible so we have time to take a few, and then I'll ask the panelists before we sign off to give us your kind of final thoughts and calls to action, especially. So because we will repurpose this as well, so folks will hopefully be able to take action with you. Charles, I see that you have your hand up. If you want to just chime in and you've got a question.
Sure. So one of the things that's been worrying me over the past decade or so is seeing how dramatically the Overton window has shifted on questions like censorship and freedom of speech. I mean, it's been a little over 10 years since Vic Taves got laughed right out of Parliament for saying, you're either with us or with the child pornographers. And now there's pretty much all-party consensus on that platform. And I'm wondering if Donald Trump just broke the left. If the left started to say, well, if people listen to disinformation and vote for somebody like Trump, then maybe freedom of speech isn't worth it after all.
So do you have anybody in particular you want to kind of to tackle that? Perhaps Santiago or Dave from a media perspective on freedom of speech, but could you like maybe reframe it into a question? Or
Sorry about that. I couldn't re-unmute myself, so I'm muted.
that's okay, you're on lockdown here.
Do you think that we on the left have abandoned concepts like freedom of speech too easily? That we've moved into this idea that maybe the people are just too dumb not to hear disinformation and believe it and vote based on it? Which would have been a fringe position during the Cold War.
I've got comment. Santiago, do you want to comment on that or?
I'll let you tackle it.
Well, okay, like panelists, like if you got your hand up and you want to say something on this, I think Charles, especially from what we've heard here, is kind of the opposite, and that doesn't speak to like other people out there that are trying to put restrictions on and the left. And if we're talking politics, you got me saying that there is no left. So I'm kind of wanting to see it from the organizers and activist perspective, in which we ourselves are fighting for space to say what we need to say, where our language is being curtailed in ways that like we don't appreciate and that we're completely disregarding. Fatima gave the example from the river to the sea, or calling for an revolution. If we're talking as socialists, to be so bold as to use certain languages that we know aren't going to go over well, or perhaps might be incitement to a degree of disruption anyway. And so, yeah, from this room's perspective, I would say no, there's no curtailing of free speech. But I guess maybe does someone want to hit on what the need to curtail? Is that a way to curtail some of these awful narratives, is to limit free speech? I mean, personally, I would say no, but there's always like limits to what you want people to be able to say. And fire in a crowded theater is just like the example most people use. But
well, and actually, Jessica, can I speak to that?
Yeah.
Specifically to fire in a crowded theater, because I always think it's an interesting example, because it comes from a United States Supreme Court case, Schenck versus United States, that had nothing to do with fire or theaters. It was about censoring Socialist Party newsletters calling for people to resist conscription, not to register for the draft.
I hear you. Yeah, no, like I see with media perspective, there's a lot of issues there, and I feel like maybe that's a conversation that needs more space to explore. It just kind of brings in politicians and their pushes, and we've not really kind of opened that in this discussion right now, but definitely something to chew on. And I'll leave the chat open right now if folks want to chime in on what Charles had to say. But thank you, Charles.
You're welcome.
So, oh, good. Aaliyah, you just have to unmute yourself and welcome.
Hello. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to like say a little thing around the censorship. As maybe I'm just not seeing the critiques coming from the or the support coming from the left as much as from like liberals. And also I feel that a relevant aspect of quote unquote speech now is sort of like the tech sector and the fact that it's like really underregulated, and that so much of the way we communicate with each other publicly is mediated through these like this like oligopoly like non-state actors who control so much and actually do themselves sort of control speech. So that's sort of the perspective that I come at it more as like, I think that, things like RF Virani's like online hate speech is a way to for the Liberal Party to sort of wash their hands of the problem of the power of these like tech giants in controlling our speech, and through doing that and through these platforms of actually like really impacting our politics.
So you mean like controlling our speech through the way that they design algorithms and shadow bans or sometimes literally taking down what folks end up posting. We're on lockdown here. We've muted her again. But is that what you
Yeah,
mean?
sorry.
When you say tech, like that, like the other mechanisms of silencing speech?
Yeah, I mean, you could just see it even, I don't know, anecdotally or experientially with like the Elon Musk takeover of Twitter and how that's changed the way that certain things get are like mediated. Not to go into too many specifics because I'm not like a Wired journalist, but I think, there's been a lot of writing on Elon Musk's sort of like even things like, for example, recent decisions, sorry, not Twitter, X, and the decision to make likes private, so that people wouldn't be afraid of liking unpopular opinions. And I think from like an organizing perspective, it's been hard because things like that have helped us call out like media bias. I know that in the last several months, you could see in like journalists like tweets that they are clearly like they're being assigned to protest while clearly holding like privately Zionist beliefs. Um, and the playing field is just not even. Like as journalists, like have as many journalists, including Palestinian journalists, but also recently Davide Mastracci has talked about how he's seen in Canadian newsrooms the way that Palestinian journalists are prevented from being able to be considered objective just because of who they are. While not only are Zionist journalists treated differently in that respect, but they're actually seen as a guide to how to cover this correctly. So it's not just treated as like a different political perspective, but the correct one that we should all, like all newsrooms should be following. So.
Thank you. That kind of plays into that narrative of uh, demonizing one side as irrational and incapable of being objective, whereas the other side is calm and legitimate and the go-to source, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, which I'm sure is just so frustrating.
Yeah, it's frustrating because like at the end of the day, like everyone knows that news is not objective in Canada. And like whether yeah, I don't believe that Palestinian journalists can be objective. I don't believe that they should be objective is the thing. Right? Like I think that this idea of objectivity has done more damage uh when it comes to media than any good, because it just means that the biases that are more in line with the status quo, that aren't as obvious because of the Overton window, they fly by every day without editors noticing. But the second that somebody who brings that, lived experience brings that to their journalism, it's very obvious that there's a bias there, and then they see that, and then that gets stories capped, and I think that's a really like relatable experience.
Santiago, now we're going to kind of go through the panelists and just kind of get some final thoughts on this specific discussion of managing the narratives before we go. And, please include any call to actions that you folks might have. So we are live. There's people that can respond quickly. And like I said, we'll repurpose this into a podcast where we'll include all the resource links that we've shared throughout the show again, so folks can really digest the conversation or catch it if they missed any. But I'm going to start with Anna, if that's all right, and just kind of your final thoughts on managing the narrative or not.
Yeah, I think, just like I would tell the media, the number one thing that we need to be worried about right now is the genocide that's happening live from Gaza, right? And so if you're scared to do something because of your desire to manage the narrative, forget it. Like, leave it behind, because I think we're reaching a point where we've all realized that this, which is not to say obviously anti-Semitism doesn't exist, but this response that all pro-Palestinian support is anti-Semitic, we have seen is garbage, right? We have seen the ways that the Zionist entity tries to shoot down our work through their discourses, and we've seen through it, right? And I think enough of people in the world have that it shouldn't stop us from, putting what needs to be put at the forefront, which is the mass extinction of Palestinians, right? So, keep speaking, keep getting out there on the streets, do what you got to do, till Palestine is free.
In our lifetime. Dave, did you want to? And then we'll let
Sure.
Fatima.
I'm really interested in this because I think media is sort of a mysterious area for a lot of people, a mysterious sort of like black box or whatever, and it shouldn't be. It like how newsrooms work, how to like contact journalists, how to pitch something, how to do narrative work. So one thing that I've been realizing is I've been wanting to do more like sharing of that sort of nuts and bolts of how it works. And I encourage people to like get involved because the thing is, in terms of like independent and left media, there's so little of it. And there are a lot of people like I will talk to people and I'll be like, yeah, I'm like doing an article on this, and people will be like, oh yeah, I was looking into that, and then it just went nowhere, or like I sent one tweet about it or something, which is important too. Tweeting is important. Uh, but there's just like not, we haven't transferred the skill, and there's not as much of like a sort of groundswell of independent journalism that's happening right now in a way that there used to be. There used to be a lot of report backs that people would write from rallies and stuff. So that's something I'm reflecting on. And I am like excited about this conversation. I think my other takeaway is just that the media strategy and how much to correct the narrative will really depend on the goals and the strategy that you're taking. So in something like a pipeline battle or like getting the arms embargo, the Globe and Mail does matter. CBC does matter, like how things are covered there, because the government cares about those things. So if they're going to change their position, it's going to matter in mainstream media. Some of the other small things that get picked up on, like whether this rally was like did this exact thing, or whether someone said something that was offensive or whatever, a lot of that is negligible in the grand scheme of things. And it's just there's too much to ever respond to as a journalist, as campaigners, whatever. But keep in mind again, just like whatever the objective is and whatever the goal is, that will sort of dictate how much put energy into the media narrative, because the media strategy is going to flow from the larger strategy. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dave. Fatima, can you leave us with some parting words?
Absolutely. So I want to remind everybody to always center Palestinian voices, and not only Palestinian voices here, but also Palestinian voices in Gaza. The world has shifted. So the media strategies here are quite important, just like Dave pointed out. But also, we have different forms of media now with social media and these things. So, centering the Palestinian voices on the ground there. And also, when it comes to these rallies that we are doing here in Canada, I know from people in Gaza that they see it and they're so shocked to see it. They always say there's people in Canada that are going out in -30 weather to protest for us, and they're shocked to see it and delighted to see it. And I'm sure you guys have seen different clips of stuff similar to that. So to center those voices and to make sure you keep them at the forefront of your efforts. To also center the whole reason we're doing this here in Canada is not just so people there can see it, but also to remind ourselves about the Canadian complicity that's happening here and to really strategize around that and to find the different ways. Because I've been learning about different ways that Canada, so called Canada, is complicit in this genocide. And there's things that I'm still uncovering that I can't believe is true. And to really strategize around those things. It's not, be as loud as possible 100%, but also really strategic in that. And I'm trying to, in Edmonton, in our little corner of the world where nothing ever happens, figuring out ways that are going to be really strategic to kind of disrupt here. And then also the last thing I want to leave you guys with is if anybody asks you, what can we do for the Palestinian people? Because I can't go out to a rally and I can't disrupt and I can't center Palestinian voices because I don't have a platform. The one thing you can always do is learn more. So Palestinians exist. We are here. Learn more about us. Delve deep into it. And there's so much resources out there. So just learn more. The Black Panthers famously said that. They just said, keep learning. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for having me. And sorry again that I was late.
Please don't apologize. Thank you so much to the panelists for sharing your knowledge, understanding the value of sharing your knowledge and building together like this. And I know you're all terribly busy, so I thank you for your time on top of all of the things that you already do. I'm so heartened to hear folks speak. I mean, I think I've talked to Anna a few times and I know she would reaffirm her stance, like, don't worry about what other people are saying. You go do you. And I hope folks embrace that kind of fearlessness, but also understanding the value of having a media strategy and how to do it effectively and recognizing that there are other outlets out there. And so I think we'll somehow, he didn't offer, but we'll take Dave up on his sort of offer to further explain how folks could better utilize independent media and work alongside them, how movements can work alongside them. Because yeah, their resources are even more limited than those newsrooms that we're complaining about. And so any assistance that they can get to tell our stories or to get that firsthand reporting or knowledge back out there is surely going to be helpful. And to Fatima, yeah, to always keep learning. That really is what we try to do at Blueprints. We rarely pretend to have any answers unless we do research and we do give information. But generally what we're doing is we're pulling people in to spaces and trying to learn from each other. And the more support that we get to do stuff like that, the more interactive elements that we can have. But that is the heart of the podcast and of Blueprints of Disruption, is to just get all that knowledge out there so we don't have to make the mistakes. We can learn from other people's and also draw on their courage and success stories. So that's my pitch again for the podcast. But you don't understand how much I appreciate all of the activists that came into the call and added knowledge to the conversation and that continue to come on the show and just kind of help build that community, right? So we get where we need to go a little faster. Because in my lifetime, I want to believe that, right? I need to believe that. So thank you all so very much. for taking the time to come. Be sure to follow the folks that you've seen here. They're doing great work, and to keep each other safe out there, because we keep each other safe.